Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 12th Annual UCLA MedTech Partnering Conference. I'm so glad you're joining us today. I'm Dina Lozofsky. I'm the Senior Director of Business Development for UCLA's Technology Development Group. The 12th MedTech Conference at UCLA acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino-Tongva peoples. A huge special thank you to our two premium sponsors, Nix and Peabody. This is the 5th year they're supporting us as a premium sponsor. And yes, thank you. And KPPB, which is sponsoring the demo track, including the $10,000 prize that goes to the best demo today. Thank you so much to our supporting sponsors, Riverside Law, Quarles, and Bioscience LA. Our Bruin sponsors, thank you. We could not do this without you. And speaking of could not do this without you, thank you to all of our community partners. You've helped us make this a truly ecosystem event. Thank you. So with that, let's get this party started. I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Medell Briggs-Malonson, who will speak about human-centric AI, shaping a just and ethical future in health technology. Dr. Medell Briggs-Malonson is the Chief of Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for UCLA Health System. She's also an Associate Professor of Emergency Medicine at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. Dr. Briggs-Malonson is also the founder and CEO of Contour Health Solutions, a national advisory firm that partners with health technology organizations and investors to develop inclusive and high-performing technologies that promote optimal health and well-being among all populations. Dr. Briggs-Malonson currently serves as the co-chair of the United States HHS Office of the National Coordinator Health Information Technology Advisory Committee. Dr. Briggs-Malonson?
Thank you so much, Dina, for that amazing, warm introduction. Good morning, everyone. It is such a distinct honor and pleasure to be here at the 12th Annual MedTech Conference. And as Dina mentioned, my name is Medell Briggs-Malonson, and today I want to speak to you a little bit about human-centric artificial intelligence. We all know that AI is on top of mind for everyone, but there's really important things that are going on currently within our industry. And all of you all as innovators and investors, there's certain special guidelines that are important as well. So without further ado, let's jump right on in. So what is artificial intelligence? Now, there's many different definitions for artificial intelligence, but I like to define artificial intelligence as an umbrella term that is used to describe technologies that exhibit various different functionalities in order to make decisions, recommendations, as well as overall predictions, but they also learn from them. And they learn from them in a way in which they're able to solve complex problems similar to human intelligence. And as we all know, in the world of healthcare in particular, there's lots of emerging technologies. And when we look specifically at this ecosystem, we see a lot of different things that are coming out of the industry. Many of you all are actually engaged in this. We have the definitions of all these technologies in clinical uses, but we also have it in administrative uses. So clinical uses, we really are looking more and leaning into predictive analytics that are specifically driven by machine learning. We also have all of the computer vision that is really powered also through the deep learning so that we can take a look at MRI, CT scans, pathology labs, and be able to pick up those small nuances for diagnostics. But then also there's this new world of decision support systems. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that also in a moment. But really how we develop precision treatment plans for our patients based off a machine as well as human input. And then there's clinical robotics. Any surgeons in the room? No surgeons? Oh, I see a couple of them. So for instance, we have robotics such as the Da Vinci robots that have been around for a while, but now we have new robots that are actually emerging as well, which yes, they won't replace us as physicians, but they will be important adjuncts and even have the precise fine movement in order to do certain levels of procedures as well as surgeries that we as humans may not be as capable of. But what about in terms of the administrative uses as well? So of course we have natural language processing. So as I'm speaking right now, all of our various different technologies can pull out those keywords and we can actually develop new insights without having fixed fields. And then we also have the other form of predictive analytics. So for instance, right now within UCLA Health, we have a large amount of artificial intelligence that takes a look at our flow through our hospital and predicts the capacity that we may have literally 2 weeks from now so that we can staff up and have the right number of doctors and nurses as well as supplies. And then of course, there's all of the various different virtual health assistants, all of our chatbots, which we can actually make sure that patients are actually engaging with these chatbots and they may not even need to speak with a physician or a nurse for the basic information. Okay, I put that disclaimer on it. And then last but not least, our other administrative robotics as well. So really thinking about pharmaceuticals and supply chain and making sure we are as efficient as possible. So when you look at this, it's like, wow, AI is fantastic, right? AI is going to transform how we do healthcare. It is going to make sure that all of our health outcomes and efficiencies are top notch. Well, there's some truth to that, but then there's also things that we have to consider. So what are some of the potential benefits and risk of artificial intelligence? Well, let's first start off with all of the wonderful benefits. So as I mentioned, artificial intelligence and all of these new technologies that we're developing, without a doubt, are going to be able to help us to identify and manage not only our bread and butter medical problems, but our complex conditions as well. In addition to that, artificial intelligence is going to be able to decrease the burden that we as physicians and other clinicians experience. So I'm an emergency physician. I was on the very front line of COVID, but I was also at the same time a health system executive. And I can tell you there is no other scarier time in any of our lives than during COVID-19, and especially before the vaccination. But what happened is that after COVID-19, we have seen a huge increase in volume of highly complex patients that are crowding our emergency departments and our hospitals and our clinics. And our physicians and our nurses and our techs and all of our different healthcare personnel are exhausted. We are exhausted. So therefore, artificial intelligence, when designed the right way, can actually alleviate those burdens and also make sure that we continue to develop that provider-patient relationship. But then also increasing efficiency of all of our operational tasks. That's really important, as mentioned, in order to make sure that we're flowing as smoothly as possible in our healthcare systems. And then all the various different novel insights for new therapeutics, not only pharmaceuticals, but digiceuticals, and all of these other types of new emerging pieces that we can treat all of our various different populations, not only here within the US, but throughout the entire world. And then last but not least, having all of this AI will allow our patients to have increased amount of education as well as engagement with their own health. So when you think about that, so many great potential benefits. But let's talk about the risk. That's why I'm always here. And so this is part of why I actually do a lot of the work that I do, of understanding and seeing the potential benefits of all of our technologies. But we have to make sure our technologies are built in the right way to avoid these risks that I'm going to mention. So what are some of these top risks? Well, number one, we already know that all AI is built on data that we already have. Well, our data oftentimes reflects our society, which is inherent with biases as well as discriminatory natures. So therefore, a potential risk of artificial intelligence is to amplify these implicit and structural biases 1,000 times over, 1,000,000 times over. In addition, there may be an increase in automation bias, meaning, oh gosh, well, you know what? The machine said that was right, so I'm just gonna go ahead along with the machine. I'm not gonna use my own clinical knowledge in order to decipher if this is correct for my patient or not. In addition to that, over-reliance on all of these different models and the fact that AI is not perfect, right? And it can produce ineffective, unsafe recommendations. So therefore, we as humans have to make sure that we're monitoring it correctly. But also in the world of healthcare, and I would probably say in any industry, there's a lot of evidence or non-evidence-based common practices, meaning, well, that's the way we've always done it. So of course, we're just gonna keep on doing it that way. How many times do we always say that? Like, but we've always done that. That's not correct, and especially when it comes to artificial intelligence. Because just because we've always done something a certain way does not mean that we need to bake that into our training models and into the models that are actually deployed completely out to the entire society. So that's a huge risk. But then in addition to that, when it comes to overall health outcomes, there's many, many outcomes that are disparate, and we do not understand why. So until we take a step back and try to understand why we even have variations in health outcomes between patient populations, we don't want to bake that into what we're building into our technologies. And then last but not least, of course, all the cybersecurity risks. We just had a major breach, as we all know, a couple of weeks ago. But as we actually lean into technology even more, that does increase the vulnerability. So with all of these different pieces that are emerging, this is actually an ad from Salesforce where it says, if AI is the Wild West, who's the sheriff? And that is a real question right now. Who is the sheriff? And I promise you, I speak to all of the leads of the federal government, and I'm like, you all, what are we doing? Let's work together. Like, what's the plan? So this is the plan, though. Our lead of Office of the National Coordinator, our leads of the FDA, our leads of the Office of Civil Rights, our lead overall of HHS have said this. It said there has to be a partnership between industry and government. That is what everyone is saying right now. And the reason why this is so important is because while we have to make guidelines to build this technology in an ethical way, in a just way, we don't want to prevent innovation. And right now, the government, we really don't know what's the best way to regulate this new technology that we really have never scaled at this level. And by the way, artificial intelligence has been around for decades. In fact, my first presentation on artificial intelligence took place in 2018. Okay, but we're seeing it much more in our daily lives through all the various different industries. So this is what our government is saying right now. And there's a lot of different frameworks that are out there, but I really wanted to highlight 4 primary frameworks that are the most recent frameworks to think about how we need to build and govern artificial intelligence. And so the very first one is actually, and which by the way, it kind of surprised many of us, we didn't know it was coming, was when President Biden actually signed in the executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy artificial intelligence in October 2023. Now, if you have not read this, I highly recommend reading it because this is moving quickly. So as executive orders are executed, things have to go into play. And honestly, we are seeing a lot of changes. And there's a specific section in the executive order that is geared towards health artificial intelligence, as well as artificial intelligence in the VA population as it pertains to health. And so I won't go into all the details due to the short nature of this presentation, but please take a look at that. And word on the DC streets is that there's going to be an update to this executive order coming down the pike in about 4 to 6 weeks, okay? Now, the next thing that came out is from the American Medical Association, and this was an update to some of their prior guidelines, and this was released in November 2023. We're really looking at the principles for augmented intelligence development, deployment, and use. And then the Office of the National Coordinator came out with something that's very near and dear to my heart, because the High-Tech Committee, in which I am a co-chair of, we provided over 46 recommendations on how to appropriately take a look at AI and develop safeguards around it. And the Office of the National Coordinator adopted many, many of those recommendations. So the final rule was published in December of 2023, and I'll give you a highlight of that in just a moment. And then last but not least, the World Health Organization also updated some of its recommendations and guidelines for artificial intelligence use in healthcare, called Ethics and Governance of Artificial Intelligence for Health in January 2024. And I'll give you a little snippet of that too. So the Office of the National Coordinator, and which this is called HTI-1. So that's what we affectionately call it because of its incredibly long name, as you saw on the previous slide. And so what it really focused on, there's a lot that's in this rule, but what I really want to bring your attention to is where it comes to the decision support interventions. And what the Office of the National Coordinator proposed is that while right now, we're not going to make explicit guidelines for all artificial intelligence or even for decision support interventions, which were previously called clinical decision support. We're just going to focus on those technologies that interface with certified health IT, meaning our EHRs and other technologies that are certified by the Office of the National Coordinator. And so there's a large amount of information on this, but due to time, I won't go through this. And by the way, these are slides directly from the Office of National Coordinator that I'm using. So feel free to go to their website, healthit.gov, and you can definitely take a look at these same slides and also adopt them into your presentation. But there were 4 primary goals of HTI-1 when it was being developed. When thinking about how do we govern decision support interventions that are enabled by artificial intelligence. And the 4 primary goals was number 1, it has to be transparent. So we have to improve the transparency of how all of these predictive DSIs are even developed, the data that they're used, how they're trained, how they're evaluated, and their overall risk management profiles. The second thing is that we have to increase trustworthiness to the general public and clinicians for these DSIs. And that means creating new labels. Has anybody heard of the nutritional labels that are coming out from ONC? Will soon, and this will go into effect within the next month, any type of artificial intelligence decision support intervention that is part of certified health IT in this country, you have to be able to be transparent and list the population that you started your model on, how it was tested, and its intended uses. And that has to be face up for all clinicians and for health systems to understand. And then there's also fostering an information ecosystem. And this is another area that's very close and near and dear to my heart. Because as a physician, as healthcare systems, how do we even know if we want to use this predictive analytic tool? How do we know that it's valid? Well, the Office of the National Coordinator put forth what's called FAVES, FAVES, which stands for really true principles of looking at, is this DSI fair? Does it have an appropriate use? Is it valid? Is it rooted in clinical integrity? Is it effective in what it says it needs to do? And last but definitely not least, is it safe? And so the phase is really what is being promoted by the Office of the National Coordinator to assess all artificial intelligence, and especially those that are baked in to our certified health technology. And then last but not least, advanced health equity by design. So this is one of the reasons why I serve as co-chair of HITAG, is because my real position is the intersectionality between how do we promote technology rooted in equity and justice. And so the government and definitely ONC has taken that same stance of making sure to help to create new standards, that all these standards are rooted in equity and justice for all communities. So now there are 3 quick federal agencies, and then this will be the end of your kind of update on what's going on in the government. But there are 3 key federal agencies that are currently overseeing all artificial intelligence in our country that is going to be deployed. And the 3 federal agencies are the Office of Civil Rights, the FDA, as well as the Office of the National Coordinator. Now, this is a really important slide, a beautiful slide, because so many times we were like, again, who's the sheriff? Well, guess what? There's kind of 3, and they're still not really sheriffs yet, but we're working on that. So the Office of the Civil Rights is responsible for making sure that no one in this country experiences discrimination. And what it actually says is that if you are a provider or a health system and you are adopting any artificial intelligence, well, guess what? If there's any discriminatory practices that result of you using that artificial intelligence, you will be held accountable. So that's really important to know. Then when it comes to the FDA The FDA scope is really over those inventors, those innovators, especially those of you all that are in the room, where it says that if you are creating a software or a device that is AI enabled, you must receive FDA approval for demonstrating its safety and its effectiveness. Okay, and there are certain guidelines that the FDA has. And then what ONC's position is that if you are actually a system or you are also a health IT developer developing new technology that again is baked in, is interfaced with certified health IT, then you have to provide transparency information and that predictive DSI to clinical customers. That information has to be known. So now we kind of know who's kind of governing, but there still needs to be a lot more in terms of setting up the guidelines. And there's even a contingency that all of us are flying to DC tomorrow to meet with the AI task force through HHS, as many of the other congressional committees, to speak even more about what we need to do to partner with industry, but then also to still make sure that we have regulations for safe as well as ethical, as well as just technologies. So last bit, WHO. Ethical principles for use of AI in healthcare. The reason why I wanted to present this is because all of these different frameworks, many different agencies, many different organizations have what they think defines safe and ethical AI. But I felt like the World Health Organization was the most clean and concise and easy to understand. And there are 6 primary principles and which the WHO says should be baked into artificial intelligence. Number 1, we had to protect autonomy. Number 2, we had to promote well-being, human safety, and the public interest for everyone globally. We have to ensure transparency, explainability, and yes, intelligibility. We can't create AI or technologies where it's a black box and nobody can explain it. That's not appropriate, okay? So think about that for those of you all that are innovators in the room and for those of you that are investors in the room. And then also, we had to foster responsibility and accountability. And of course, we had to ensure inclusiveness and equity. And last but not least, which I love, we had to promote AI that is responsible and sustainable, meaning do no harm to our environment either. So those are the 6 principles from the WHO, which I think are some of the best and easy to understand principles. So now that we've gone over and we tried to figure out the emerging cases of AI in healthcare, we've also talked about what the governmental agencies, what their positions are. Well, how do we continue to create and develop and innovate? And how do we do so in a way that we know we are producing the best products to benefit all humankind? Well, I want to first start off with some of my recommendations. And the number 1 set of recommendations is that I want everyone in this room never to do the 3 things that I'm about to tell you. I do not want anyone to ever fall into the 3 critical data errors that I am going to explain to you. And let's go over those critical data errors. Number 1, biased collection of data. Number 2, biased interpretation of data. And number 3, interpretation of biased data. Okay? Now, let's go through each one of these, and I'm going to give you a clinical case just because I love bringing medicine into all of these various different topics. So we're going to go over a true case that impacted not only our country, but also the entire world. And this is a case about the estimated glomerular filtration rate, otherwise known as eGFR. Does anyone know, familiar with eGFR? Yes, we definitely have some hands. So eGFR is something that we still to this day commonly use in order to measure kidney function. However, up until 2020, we were using eGFR calculations that were race-based in order to assess kidney functions. And what occurred was that what eGFR really measures is how well your kidneys are functioning. However, as we will see in the next couple of slides, there was a multiplier that was added on to the calculations for patients who either identify as Black or were perceived to be Black, so that there was a difference in what was considered normal function for those people that identified as Black and those who were non-Black. Okay, so let's see how this happened. Well, critical data error number one. There was biased collection of data. So all of this EGFR with a race-based multiplier that was included was based off of three studies only that were performed between the 1970s and the 1990s. And if you look at these studies, they were so scientifically flawed in every single way. The overall population sample of each of the studies was somewhere from 40 to 60 people, and especially for those who identified as Black. In addition, total, all the studies were less than 350 total of all the people in these studies. So there was not only a very small number of people in the studies, but it had lack of diversity in the studies as well. And so because of the small numbers, because of the lack of diversity, and because of not looking at so many other factors that determines how someone's kidneys or how someone's metabolism may function, we ended up with incredibly flawed studies, which these studies would never fly in 2024, ever, ever, ever. So there was a biased collection of data that was obtained from small towns throughout our country. And these studies then went on to the next critical data error. So from these biased collection of data, which was not systematic, which was not representative of a larger population, well, there was an interpretation of this biased data. So the results of these flawed studies led to various assumptions because in this study, especially one in particular, it noticed a small increase of what's called creatinine, which is a protein that measures your kidney function. So they said, well, the Black patients in this study, although it was less than 50, the Black people in this study have a higher rate of creatinine. So maybe they just have higher muscle mass, or maybe just at baseline, their kidneys function differently from those people that are not Black. Oh, or maybe they just have really, really poor diet. So that's just what happens. So therefore, their kidneys just function differently from those that are not Black. Super flawed in every way. So in case you all do not know, race is literally a social ideology that was used to categorize all of us. The Human Genome Project proved that all of us in this room, that all of us throughout the entire globe, we share 99.9% the same exact genetic material. Now, our genes can be expressed differently. So for instance, our genes may actually determine how curly our hair is, what color our skin is, what color our eyes are. But your heart and my heart function the same. Your kidneys and my kidneys function the same. There is no anatomic or biologic difference between any of us. So this, again, erroneous assumptions. Now, what happened from that? Well, interpretation of biased data. So what occurred is that from the very beginning, biased collection of data, highly underrepresentative, not diverse enough, then went into erroneous assumptions about Black people and how their kidneys function, which then was baked into a clinical algorithm that every single hospital and clinic within this country and almost throughout the entire world used. Okay. And guess what happened? Well, automatically, what resulted was that Black patients were deemed to have a higher acceptable level of this creatinine. So therefore, it was assumed their kidneys just don't function as well as people who are white or non-Black. And that led to a delayed diagnosis of kidney dysfunction and failure within the Black community. It also led to a delayed transplant evaluation when someone's kidneys actually ended up failing. And that has resulted in significant racial inequities in kidney disease, failure, and overall leading to death. And this is all documented. So this is why data matters. This is why understanding data matters, and especially before we involve them into algorithms or technology, because it can actually lead to death within a significant population. So that's my warning to all of you all. Unfortunately, UCLA has eliminated all race-based algorithms within our health system, as well as many other health systems throughout the country, but we're still not there yet. So what do we need to do? There's a lot of other data biases that impact healthcare, and I won't go through all of them, but I want to make sure that you all know that AI is here, and we are already seeing some of the potential negative effects of AI as well. And so we have four main different types of biases. There's incomplete data, which means that if we don't have a representative population, of course, the models are going to lean towards whatever data is in those models. Then there's historic bias data, right? So really focusing on the past and oftentimes modern prejudices that we as humans may have or have actually been enacting within our healthcare systems. So therefore, the models just replicate society, our current state. And so that's something that we have to be very thoughtful on and prevent. There's also sampling bias. Again, going back to the kidney eGFR, if we do not have representative samples, it's only going to know and lean towards those samples that are in the model. So if we only have, for instance, women, we're not going to understand how these models function on men and vice versa. And then also measurement bias, where oftentimes our AI models, they just may not produce effective type of processes. So where have we actually seen a lot of this from as well? So we have already seen these studies in healthcare utilization, where when there have been AI algorithms, it has actually predicted erroneous assumptions regarding healthcare utilization and care coordination, where it has leaned more towards affluent white populations of giving them more care and actually away from lower income populations and or communities of color. We've already seen that problem happen. And fortunately, that team corrected it. But also in terms of diagnosis, we see some of these biases as well, where there can be inaccurate diagnoses of skin color in patients with darker skin, only because the models did not have that data to train on. And then also for risk prediction, one of our most well-known risk predictors for cardiovascular disease is really focusing on the Framingham risk studies. And so in this study itself, it really didn't have that many people of color nor women. So therefore, it's less sensitive to predict cardiovascular disease. So what can we do? So these are the three principles that I want you all to think about and incorporate directly into all of your technologies. And the three primary principles needed to design, develop, and deploy ethical and just healthcare AI are: number one, inclusive representation; number two, transparency, and not just transparency to physicians and other clinicians. We'll talk about who it needs to be transparent to. And number three, harm and bias prevention. Inclusive representation. We live in a beautiful country and a beautiful world with so many different people of so many different backgrounds and beliefs. And in addition to that, we want to make sure that so much of what we do when we're building technology is as inclusive as possible. And so the way to actually achieve this is to ensure that our initial data sets, as well as our training data, is representative of all populations that may be impacted. And this goes beyond just standard demographics like race, ethnicity, gender identity, etc. I want you all to think about those living with different abilities. I want you to think about those that have rare medical conditions, because those two populations also, and many others, are the ones that tend to be excluded when thinking about our new emerging technologies. And in addition to that, what is very, very critical is to engage and incorporate the voices of those who are going to be directly impacted by your AI technologies, because they will have different vantage points. They will have different recommendations that just standard the engineers or others may not have. And I really do want to make sure that this is emphasized, that incorporation of the diverse voices should occur along the entire cycle, from design to development, to deployment, to the audits, okay? Not just in one area, throughout. And this, I have to say, because I know we have many innovators and investors in the room, I always get the piece of, well, gosh, we're trying to really promote equity and justice, but we're also trying to build a really good, high-performing, high-revenue business model. Let me tell you something. Those two are never mutually exclusive. And in fact, the more inclusive your technology is, the greater that you can capture the market. And when you capture a large percentage of the market, that drives your business model, and that literally escalates all of your revenue. So inclusivity It's never an and, it's never an or when it comes to your business profits. It's always an and. The more inclusive you are, the better your business is going to be. So just think about that and remember that. The other thing is about data transparency. And so as we've seen, even with ONC and others, is there's a real push about having all of our various different analytics to be as transparent as possible. But what I actually challenge everyone in this room is to commit to full transparency of how all of the various different AI is actually, the data's collected, what the overall design is intended to be, and then also how it's expected to be used, and most importantly, test your model on all of those various different vulnerable populations and reveal that information. If the model doesn't work well on a certain subset, say that. Because that information is critical for whomever is going to be using those models or that technology later on, so they know not to apply it to that subset. But then go back and fix your technology so that it can benefit everyone, okay? But then also when it comes to the transparency, it's really important that we develop our information in language that people can understand. Okay, so there's a lot of technical jargon sometimes when we're trying to explain AI and all these other models. And I can tell you, I work with physicians all the time, and I call myself a true interpreter. I call myself a multilingual interpreter because I can speak healthcare and I can speak tech, okay? And I can speak a few other languages. And so what happens, though, is that when our innovators and our technologists and our engineers come and try to speak to clinicians, everyone's like, I don't know what they're saying. And so I'm like, well, let me translate that for you. This is what they're saying. But I want you all to learn this skill from the very beginning. Learn how to explain your technology in a way that anybody and everybody can understand, especially those that are going to be using it on their patients. But we also had to explain this technology to the people, to the patients, and which we want to improve their own healthcare. And it's important for us to always keep this in mind in terms of literacy level. I tell all my teams, I tell all my startup companies, any information that is produced, it needs to be in grade 6 or lower, regardless of the education of the people that you're presenting it to, because that will ensure clarity and that will ensure understanding. And then the third principle here, harm and bias prevention. Now, this is the core. This is what we're all trying to achieve. And so we have to now start to intentionally assess for potential discrimination, bias, or harm along the entire model cycle. Okay, it's not enough to create something and be like, okay, let's go back and see if it's hurting anybody. No, we had to do this at the very beginning. You had to say, let's think about this. Which populations made this inappropriately at our disadvantage, and how do we ensure that doesn't occur? And that is also part of recognizing biases as well as other structures that are already existent that we have to then say, should we include that? Because if we include that, we already know what's going to happen. If we include the old race-based EGFR into our models, wow, multiply that 1 million times over, what does that really result in? So I want you all to question, even if it's standard in the healthcare industry, question if it's biased or not, and if you need to include it into your technology. That's the type of intentionality we have to do at this stage in order to make sure the future does not cause harm to any populations. And then last but not least, assessing the algorithms and metrics to ensure that there's no difference in outcomes. So oftentimes we launch this technology into the world, and then we're like, okay, let's see what happens. But I want you all to be very thoughtful, and this is something that we are advocating with as well, with all of our various different regulators in Washington, D.C., is that there has to be structured risk mitigation frameworks throughout the entire cycle. So not just when you deploy it, but also at 6 months, at a year, at 3 years, to make sure that there is no unintentional consequences of the technology that has been developed. And so I want to just now go back and go over some key highlights. We've gone through a lot. I know this has been a large amount of information that's coming to you all, but I want to make sure that we summarize this in a way as I start to close. Number one, healthcare AI is a future. And in all actuality, as we all know, healthcare AI is now, but it must do no harm. And in order for it not to do harm, we have to make sure and be very strategic and thoughtful that our technology is promoting equity and overall health for all populations. The second thing is avoid the 3 critical data errors: biased collection of data, biased interpretation of data, and interpretation of biased data. Do not include this into your technologies. And if you really make sure to focus on these 3 data errors, your technology will definitely start to be built in order to ensure that it's just and ethical in every way. And then number 3, committing to the 3 principles of overall ethical, inclusive, and just AI. Inclusive representation, transparency of how you are developing your technology and what it's intended for, and then of course, being committed to preventing harm and bias. So before I leave you today, I want you to imagine this. Imagine these 3 questions. Can healthcare AI be used to effectively mitigate health inequities? And if so, how? Can we train technology to be different from humans and elevate above bias? As human beings, we all have inherent bias, and we're all on a journey to address those inherent biases. But can we train technology to be better than us? And then the last one, can AI learn from our human mistakes and prevent us from repeating them? In other words, this is our time to make sure that our artificial intelligence is truly benefiting humankind, and that we do it in a way that is not only going to benefit us now, but for generations to come. So I always like closing with one of my favorite authors, whether it's James Baldwin, Maya Angelou. And as I was reflecting on this presentation, James Baldwin's quote really just rang out to me, where he wrote, "There is never time in the future in which we will work out our salvation. The challenge is in the moment. The time is always now." And right now, we are all charged with making sure that we are the new innovators for technology that is rooted in ethical, just, and safe principles. So thank you all so much. And it was a pleasure to be with you today.